Story 1. The Scylla. The first sign was the silence. Not the silence of an abandoned vessel. Elias Thorne, captain of the salvage tug Cerberus, had heard that 100 times, but the silence of something holding its breath. It was a slate-gray afternoon, 500 miles northeast of the Azores, a place where the Atlantic was supposed to be a roaring, relentless engine. Instead, a fog the color of old milk had swallowed the sea, and the air was dead still. Thorne's crew had tracked the ghost ship for 3 days using satellite imagery that defied explanation. A massive container vessel, the Scylla, officially declared lost a decade ago, sailing at a steady 5 knots with no active transponder. "She's unnatural, skipper," muttered Jax, the first mate, adjusting the harness on his chest. Jax was a man who'd seen ships sink beneath him and walked away without a scratch, but his face, usually a roadmap of cheerful cynicism, was drawn tight. Thorne didn't disagree. The Scylla was colossal, a floating mountain of rust-streaked steel, but unnervingly intact. Not a lifeboat was missing. Not a single container seemed shifted or damaged. It looked less like a vessel lost to a storm and more like a ship that had been parked by its crew and then simply forgotten by time. "She's worth more than our annual turnover, Jax." "Uncut. Undamaged," Thorne said, though the words tasted like copper in his mouth. "The owners are long gone, the insurance payout settled. She's free salvage. We board, secure the tow, and she's ours." Thorne, Jax, and 2 other crewmen, Mira and Cole, boarded via a low cargo door left inexplicably ajar near the waterline. The first step onto the steel deck was like crossing a threshold into a deep-sea cavern. The air inside was several degrees colder than the sea air, and carried a pervasive, mineral smell, not the oil and brine of a working ship, but something closer to ozone and pulverized bone. The only sound was the hollow, echoing clank of their boots. They moved quickly to the superstructure, their flashlights carving weak cones through the pervasive gloom that seemed to stick to the bulkheads. "Engine room first," Thorne ordered, his voice low. "We need to confirm power is dead. If she's drifting, something is spinning the screw. Even if it's residual." The engine room was an immediate rejection of logic. It was spotless. Not a single tool was misplaced, and the massive diesel engines, enough to power a small town, were chilled to the touch. The gauges, however, were not dead. The oil pressure indicator was resting unnervingly at a number just above 0. "The needle shouldn't be there, Skipper," Mira whispered, her beam focused on the dashboard. "There's no power, no heat, yet that dial is registering pressure." Jax ran a gloved hand over the engine block. "It's been cold for days. Weeks, maybe. But the oil," he tapped a small inspection window. The oil inside was clear, clean, and viscous, as if it had been checked just yesterday. It was here, in the heart of the ship, that they experienced the first sensory anomaly. A low-frequency hum, too deep to be heard, yet they all felt it vibrating in their molars. It rose, peaked, and then vanished, leaving the silence heavier than before. "Let's try the bridge," Thorne decided, impatience warring with dread. "We need the logs. We need to know what they were carrying and where they were going." The climb up the metal stairs felt endless, each level repeating the same impossible scene, perfectly organized chaos. A galley with pots scrubbed clean, a laundry room with a dryer full of freshly folded towels. A gym with a treadmill belt frozen mid-stride. They reached the bridge. It was eerily preserved. The helm stood centered, the brass spokes gleaming dully. The navigation screen was dark, but the emergency radio, an old satellite model, glowed with a faint, pale green standby light. On the main console, 2 things drew their attention. First, the captain's logbook. It wasn't bound leather, but a modern digital tablet. Thorne picked it up. It was heavy, and the screen flashed to life, displaying a single, continuous entry. August 12th. Lat. 32.14 N. Lon. 26.09 W. Ship is fine. Crew is fine. Cargo is fine. We have reached the place where the maps cease to apply. They will meet us here. The salt cannot stop them. The date was August 12th, 4 days from now. Second, the captain's chair. Slumped in it was a dry husk wearing the uniform of the Scylla's master. It wasn't decomposed, it was desiccated. Every drop of moisture had been drawn out, leaving the skin like brittle, blackened parchment stretched over bone. Jax recoiled, knocking over a coffee mug. The mug shattered, but instead of the sharp sound of ceramic, it sounded like a heavy glass jar dropping into thick honey. A muffled, slow-motion thump thump thump. Look at his hand, Cole choked out. The captain's skeletal hand was fused to the tablet, which Thorne still held. His index finger pointed to one word on the log screen: cargo. Thorne used a crowbar to pry the captain's hand free, the brittle sound of the snapping finger bones echoing in the bridge's unnatural acoustics. He shoved the tablet into his pack. We found our lead. Cargo hold 6, Thorne said, his voice flat. Cole, Mira, get back to the Cerberus and ready the tow lines. Jax, you're with me. Skipper, we need to go down. Jax asked, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. If the curse is in the cargo, the gold is in the cargo, Thorne said, pushing past the horror. We're not leaving $1 billion salvage because of a dehydrated corpse and a bad calendar. They descended to the hangar deck, where the immense hatches to the main cargo holds lay. Hold 6 was labeled with peeling stencil, but something was wrong with the metal around it. It wasn't merely rusty. The steel plates looked like they had been pulled taut, like skin stretched too tightly over a frame. The hatch wheel was massive, 6 feet across, designed to be turned by 2 men with difficulty. Thorne leaned into it. The wheel spun with a whisper of well-oiled gears, turning effortlessly, as if the door were light as paper. It's waiting for us, Jax muttered, drawing his rescue axe. The moment the seal broke, a pressure change hit them, violent and immediate. It was like standing in a deep elevator shaft when the cable snaps. Not just an upward draft, but a sensation of gravity being inverted. They were pressed against the floor, gasping. The black air rushing out of hold 6 smelled of pure, static electricity and old blood. Thorne staggered to his feet and kicked the door fully open. His flashlight beam plunged into the pit below, revealing containers stacked 20 high in the absolute darkness. But the containers weren't what stopped him. Across the massive, empty floor of the hold, 100 yards deep, a vast, complex web had been spun. It was not made of silk, but of something slick, white, and fibrous, strung between the containers like the nerve endings of a colossal, sleeping beast. In the center of the web, shimmering faintly in the oppressive air, was a single, unmarked, black steel container. It pulsed. Thump thump thump. The muffled sound of the shattered coffee mug was now louder, deeper, coming from inside the black box. It was the rhythm of a failing heart. Suddenly, the floor beneath Thorne's boots began to vibrate, not with the hum of the engine room, but with a rhythmic, wet scraping that came from deep within the web. Jax screamed, not a sound of fear, but of agony. My feet. They're stuck. Thorne turned. The fiber web had not been static. It had spread, and now it was climbing Jax's boots and ankles, hardening instantly like epoxy. Jax thrashed, pulling against the rapidly setting strands. Thorne aimed his flashlight at the closest pillar of stacked containers, and saw the truth that made his stomach dissolve. The webbing wasn't just on the floor. It was coming from the containers themselves. Every seam, every door seal, every bolt hole on the stacks around them was slowly weeping the white, viscous fiber. The Scylla hadn't carried a cursed object. The Scylla had become the container for an endless, self-generating parasite. And the black box in the middle was the heart. Thorne grabbed Jax's shoulder, pulling with all his strength, but the web held him fast. The axe, Jax. Cut it. Jax swung, but the fiber wasn't brittle. It was elastic and shockingly tough. The axe blade only sank halfway, getting jammed in the sickeningly resilient material. Above them, the hatch they had left open began to move. Slowly, with an audible grind of steel against steel, the massive circular door began to close, powered by the immense, quiet, and conscious will of the ship itself. The light source on the bridge had vanished. The last rays of outside light were shrinking to a coin-sized sliver. "It's locking us in, Elias," Jax shrieked, now pulling futilely at the web that was already past his knees. Thorne didn't hesitate. He pulled out the military-grade emergency flare from his pack, twisted the cap, and slammed it onto the deck. The phosphorus charge ignited with a deafening FWOOSH and a blinding, incandescent white light. The light didn't illuminate, it recoiled. The moment the intense heat hit the white web, the fibers shrieked. A high, thin, insectal sound that scraped across their minds like a needle on a record. The fibers around Jax's legs instantly blackened and retracted like startled tentacles. "Now, go," Thorne yelled, grabbing the axe handle and yanking. They stumbled back, running past the shrinking circle of light from the flare as the massive hatch wheel spun itself to its final, horrifying close. The last sound they heard before the absolute darkness of the cargo deck swallowed them was the sickening thump-thump-thump of the black container, now joined by a high-pitched, metallic screaming that seemed to originate from the ship's own hull. They sprinted back to the low-water cargo door, which Thorne had to blast open with the emergency cutting torch. They didn't stop until they were back on the Cerberus, hauling anchor and running the engines at a panicked, desperate maximum. Thorne stood on the bridge of his own ship, watching the Scylla disappear into the fog, moving at a steady 5 knots, carrying its unseen, throbbing, fibrous secret away into the Atlantic. He reached into his pack and pulled out the log tablet. The screen was still lit. The date was still August 12, 4 days from now. But the final entry had been subtly changed. August 12. Lat. 32.14 N. Lon. 26.09 W. Ship is fine. Crew is fine. Cargo is fine. We have reached the place where the maps cease to apply. They will meet us here. The salt cannot stop them. We sent a messenger. Thorne looked down at his own hand. A single, hair-thin, white fiber, slick and cold, was wrapped tightly around his index finger, already sinking beneath the skin. The silence was gone. Now, only the relentless throbbing of the Cerberus's engine competed with the frantic, wet scraping that Thorne could now feel vibrating in his molars once more. Story 2. The iron grip Aris grabbed Ben. Panic was cold and sharp in his throat. The heavy iron door had slammed shut, locking them deep inside the sunken warship. The sound, the horrible death loop, was still screaming inside the radio room, now vibrating through the very metal of the deck. "The SDU," Ben shouted, his voice rough. "We have to reach the sub. It sealed us in," Aris yelled back. "The ship did this. It is alive." The new voice, the high, panicked voice that had been cut short, repeated itself. "They're coming for the gold. They're not men. Close the doors. Close the..." Then, the terrible gasp, the metal shriek, and the scream of a man dying. The loop was longer now. Aris looked at the spot where the safe had slid. The sound of the gold clinking was a tiny, clear thing inside the noise of horror. It was a clue, a promise, and a deadly lure. The ship was showing them what it wanted them to see. Aris threw his body weight against the door. It did not budge. It was a pressure seal, locked tight, built for war and the crush of the deep. "We go up," Aris said, pointing to the ceiling. "The bridge. We need the comms. We need to reach the Triton." They scrambled out of the radio room and back to the stairwell. The air was getting thicker, warmer. It felt like standing inside a giant, empty copper jar. As they began to climb the steep, tilted stairs, Aris looked at the walls again. The scratches were everywhere, not just on the stairwell, but climbing up the bulkheads. They were too many, too deep to be made by one man. Aris ran his glove over one of the marks. It was sharp, freshly made. "They didn't do this when the ship sank, Ben," Aris whispered. "They did this after the door slammed. They did this while they waited for the end." The sound loop started again. This time, it was even longer. Before the captain's plea about the gold, there was a new noise. The frantic, scratching sound of fingernails on metal. It was the sound of the men who had been sealed in this stairwell, clawing at the thick iron walls, trying to escape the room of death. The ship was not just playing a sound. The ship was building a scene. Every time the loop played, it added one more detail, one more second of the final, agonizing moments of the crew. Ben was breathing heavily, his light shaking. "Aris, my ears are ringing. Even without the helmet, I hear the scream. It's in my head. It's a sonic trap," Aris said, forcing himself to move. "It's using the ship's metal to make its sound waves a physical force in our brains. Don't think about the sound. Think about the deck plates. Think about the steel." They climbed 2 levels. The ship was tilting at a severe angle, making the simple act of walking a desperate scramble. They were heading for the bridge, the highest point of the superstructure. The next level was the office's quarters. The corridor was narrow and straight. Here, the horror changed. It was clean. The floor was free of dust. The cabin doors were closed. Aris stopped. "Wait. This is wrong. At this angle, everything should have fallen. The doors should be swinging open." He tried a handle. Locked. He tried the next. Locked. Every single cabin door on this corridor was locked from the inside. They locked themselves in, Ben realized, his voice hollow. The death loop started again. This time, after the scream, a new sound appeared. The muffled, wet sobbing of many men, coming from behind the locked doors. It was a sound of absolute, broken despair, lasting only a fraction of a second before the loop reset. The ship was telling them the story of its crew's last hours. The scratches were the desperate fight to escape the sound. The locked doors were the final act of terror, sealing themselves in to die alone. "The bridge," Aris ordered. "We have to get the outside comms." They reached the bridge. It was the same room from the first scan. The helm, the ruined navigation gear. Aris looked at the main panel. The ship's own sound system was destroyed, but the emergency radio, the one that had glowed with that sickly green light, was still there. Aris tore off the panel to get to the wires. He needed to bypass the system and get a direct line to the antenna. As he worked, he noticed the captain's chair. The desiccated corpse from the original log was gone. Aris remembered the first surface scan, the empty ship. This was a lie. The corpse must have been pulled back, consumed by the ship itself. But where the captain had sat, a puddle of thick, black liquid had formed. It smelled like oil and something acrid, like burnt sugar. Aris used his light. The liquid was seeping into the wires of the emergency radio. Ben. Cutting torch. Now. Ben moved, his hands shaking, but he was quick. He cut the main power lines leading to the radio, separating it from the ship's ruined network. Aris pulled the radio free. It was bulky and heavy. He quickly patched a separate comms line from the radio directly to their SDU harness, giving them a chance to call the Triton. He pressed the transmit button. Triton, this is Aris. We are inside the Vanguardia. Do you read? Report state. Silence. Just the crackle of static. The death loop started again, now even closer to the bridge. The muffled sobbing was replaced by a sharper sound. The sound of a single gunshot, followed by immediate, profound silence, before the whole loop reset. They are playing the suicides, Aris whispered, horrified. The ship is trying to break us before it kills us. Ben stared at the deck. The safe, Aris. We saw the gold. The ship wants us to see it. Aris hesitated. The radio was useless. They were trapped. The ship was a monster that fought with memory and sound. The gold is the lure, Ben. The curse is tied to the treasure. It is why the ship won't let the death end. But if the gold is the source of the curse, maybe taking it out stops the noise. Ben's eyes were wide, but in them, Aris saw not just terror, but a strange, greedy light. Aris had to choose. Wait for the ship to play the full, final scene of death, or take the deadly bait. Main cargo hold. Below the radio room. That's where the gold would be, Aris said. We get in, grab one piece, and get out. We have to try. They left the bridge and went down, deeper still. The main cargo hold was a massive, open space. The air was now cold again, thick with the mineral smell of iron and brine. Water, finally, seemed to have collected here, covering the floor in a shallow, oily sheen. In the center of the hold, beneath a massive, rusted gantry crane, was a thick, reinforced vault door. It was built into the deck, designed to hold the wealth of a nation. And beside it, scattered across the floor, were hundreds of shimmering, antique gold coins. It's everywhere, Ben breathed, kneeling to pick up a coin. They didn't even try to hide it. It's a road right to the vault. As Ben picked up the coin, the sound loop began again, but this time, the sequence was changed. After the gasp, the shriek, and the scream, before the muffled sob or the gunshot, a new sound played. A low, satisfied sigh. The ship knew they had taken the bait. Aris felt the deck vibrate. The massive gantry crane above them, frozen for 80 years, began to move. The chain lowered, its thick iron links unwinding with a horrifying screech. The chain stopped just above the vault door. At the end of the chain, where a hook should have been, was a simple, heavy iron spike. The ship is showing us how to open it, Aris said, his voice barely a breath. It wants the vault open. Then we open it, Ben said, feverishly stuffing gold coins into his pockets. If we take the gold, the curse ends. Aris used a steel cable to attach the chain spike to the vault's massive wheel lock. He scrambled back, signaling Ben to join him. Stay clear, Ben. If it moves fast. Aris flipped the switch on the gantry's manual override box. With a grinding roar, the chain pulled taut. The thick iron spike bit into the wheel lock. The steel screamed under the pressure, the sound so loud it almost drowned out the death loop that was constantly playing. The vault door did not budge. But the sound loop suddenly stopped. A deep, unnatural silence descended upon the cargo hold. A silence worse than any noise. Aris looked at Ben, relief flooding his face. We did it. We stopped it. Then, Aris's helmet comms crackled. It was Leah. Her voice was faint, broken by static, filled with pure, panicked static. Aris. Get out. The ship is moving. The Vanguardia. It's rising. It's coming toward us. Aris looked at the sonar display on his wrist. The rectilinear shape of the Vanguardia was no longer resting in the mud. It was listing, tilting, and most impossibly, it was ascending, slowly, silently, driven by a force that defied physics. Leah, we're trapped. The inner hatch is sealed. We need an external cut. Aris shouted into the comms. Leah's voice was fading. The water is too loud. The sound, it's in the hull, it's singing. You woke it up, Aris. You woke the gold. The comms died. Absolute silence returned. And in that silence, Aris heard it. Not through the ears, but through the deep, vibrating pressure in his skull. The death loop began again, but now it was not coming from the radio room. It was everywhere. It was the ship itself, now playing its memory at full volume. The sound was longer than before. It was a full, clear, terrifying paragraph of sound. Gasp, shriek, scream, sobs, gunshot, sigh. Then, a new, final section. The sound of a heavy, metal safe door slamming shut, followed by the frantic, panicked breathing of two new men, trying to find air in a room that had none. Aris and Ben. The ship had finished recording its last moments. It was their memory now. The vault door, which had not opened, now began to sink into the deck. The pressure of the deep, which should have been outside, was now inside the hold. The water level began to rise, not from the tear in the stern, but from the rising deck itself, squeezing the air out of the cargo hold. The door didn't open, Aris whispered, backing away from the rising water. The floor is opening. The gold isn't locked in. The gold is locked down. The floor of the hold was dividing, opening like a pair of enormous, rusted jaws. In the black gap, Aris saw not a vault, but a deep, dark well leading into the ship's belly. And from the well, the sound of the death loop came rushing up, louder, clearer, and carrying something else. The low, mechanical, clanking sound of heavy machinery moving in the deep. The Vanguardia was not just sailing. It was working. Ben, staring at the opening deck, reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold coin. He held it up, his eyes shining with a crazed mixture of greed and terror. We can stop it, Aris. We just have to put it back. But as he moved to throw the coin into the dark well, the coin seemed to jump from his hand, pulled not by gravity, but by an unseen force. It spun through the air and vanished into the opening. The floor slammed shut with a final, violent clang, leaving them in the total darkness of the hold, soaked in rising water, with only the endless, mental loop of their own death gasps now playing in their heads. The only light was the faint, sickly green glow from the severed emergency radio, which was still receiving, but not sending. It was waiting for the ship to play its final scene. Aris knew they had to find the tear in the hull fast, before the Vanguardia broke the surface with them still inside, only to sink again and seal their fate forever. They were no longer salvagers. They were passengers on a vessel sailing on a cursed, endless journey. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.